let's get right down to it. John, do you see any potential conflict between your religious beliefs and the science that you engage in?
I don't. I don't see any conflict. I suppose you could have guessed I was going to answer that. I think that as a day-to-day scientist, when I go into the lab, or my grad students go to the lab, I kind of write papers. When I write papers, what happens is, I got to say that because some of them are here, what I do is I just think logically and clearly and so forth, and it's not really a whole bunch of, and then an angel came and did this. I'm not into that, okay? And you can't get published and you can't get funded if you believe that, okay? Nor do I have a tendency to do that. I think that what I would say religion in my life comes into play, the arena in which it comes into play is questions like, why is it bad to bayonet a baby, okay? Well, can evolution answer that question? I had to struggle with that, and I thought about that, and I think evolution can maybe come up with answers about why you might not do that in the society, because the societies that do that don't have their genes get passed on and so forth. But still, the difference between saying what happens, what actually happens, and what should happen is very, very different. Science can't really answer that question. It can't answer what I should do with my life. And I don't think sociobiology can answer, why we shouldn't have genocide. It can't answer that, to my mind. So, in that sense, there's all these questions that I have about why I'm here, things that Dave brought up, what my purpose is, what happens after I die. All of these things can't be answered by looking through the pages of Nature, Science, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Those things aren't going to answer those questions. And I think science, in some sense, it's not completely divorced from my life as a scientist, but I think it's perfectly fine to have both of these things going on at the same time. And certainly there are Nobel Prize-winning scientists, Bill Phillips, who was in this Pontifical Academy of Scientists, who won a Nobel Prize in physics. There's Francis Collins, who's the head of the NIH, who's an open evangelical. What are you going to say? That, well, if Phillips wasn't religious, he would have won 3 Nobel Prizes. This is crazy. It doesn't hamper his scientific thinking whatsoever. It doesn't at all, not in the least. And it doesn't hamper Francis Collins' management of the NIH. He believes that God is somehow guiding evolution. And he's not a young earth creationist, but he is a devout religious person who's in charge of the major source of biological research funding in the United States, probably in the world. It doesn't hamper his job. Nobody's putting him up in front of Congress and saying, well, you got to get out of here because of your stupid beliefs. I don't think there's a conflict whatsoever in any of those areas, as far as I can see. So.
Well, Tim, do you disagree in any way? I mean, as a secular humanist, you get your morals not from religion, so.
Yeah, that's correct. I don't think it's essential that one has religious belief in order to answer some of the questions that John raised. And in fact, I think Enlightenment values can in fact provide answers to those questions. On the other hand, now when I ask if belief in God is compatible with science, if I were to think of this in terms of the question, is belief in God rationally or logically consistent with scientific values, I might come to a belief that maybe they aren't compatible. But I think when I think about this question of compatibility, I think the issue I'm thinking about is whether people with strong religious beliefs can in fact do good science, and I think the answer is obviously yes. John just gave us examples of scientists who hold strong religious beliefs, in fact, very varying beliefs, who are perfectly capable of doing good science. I would like to emphasize that, part of the science and how it is, and how we do it, involves the fact that if you follow the rules of science and you do not try to incorporate extraneous material, then when you judge a work of science, you make no effort whatsoever to think about what's inside the heart of the person who's doing it. You simply look at the results. And therefore, I think it's actually extraneous to ask, what were the religious or philosophical beliefs of the person who carried out this piece of work. You just look at it and ask if it's good science. And in fact, if we look at cases where people tried to impose such tests, and I'm thinking about the discussions in Germany in the 30s, in which one tried to make distinctions between Aryan science and Jewish science, those we now consider to be disastrous types of restrictions. So, on that basis, I would say it's perfectly compatible, perfectly possible for it to be compatible.
Anyone else care to jump in?
Well, we could go back to Newton, who was certainly religious and was obviously a good scientist. I think that in Newton's day, which was several hundred years ago, it wasn't yet understood. Even Newton, with all his greatness, was only dimly able to perceive the idea that everything that happens in the world happens because particles are banging into each other effectively. He was able to imagine the existence of a God who would affect things on a level that was totally different from that of particles. In Newton's day, there was no evidence for the existence of atoms, let alone elementary particles, and so there was plenty of room for all sorts of different kinds of explanations of why things happen. But in the intervening several hundred years, especially in the 19th century, it became clearer and clearer that the ultimate causes of everything that happens reside on a microscopic level. And this is not a time to go into a physics course and try to explain any of that. But let me just give a little homely image for you, which is that of a billiard table or a pool table with the balls colliding. So if you imagine, let's say, you're hitting with a cue, you hit a ball and then you scatter the balls, they're all moving all around the table. They're going to interact with each other in a way that obeys the laws of physics, and there's not going to be room for any other kind of thing to affect their trajectories. At least so I believe. And if you then just sort of microscopify that, make it smaller and smaller and smaller, and say that's what's going on in the world in 3 dimensions instead of 2, and much, 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 much smaller, and with lots of different kinds of particles and more kinds of interactions than just banging off of each other, that's what I think is going on in the world. And so using the billiard table as my metaphor, to me the universe is all determined by these microscopic things happening. And that doesn't leave room for intervention, as John said, of angels or anything else of that sort. Now, there are a lot of people who do believe, though, in kinds of macroscopic causes that seem unrelated to microscopic causes. And I would I'll give some examples that you might think are silly, but it's just to set up some examples for discussion. Some people will say that you shouldn't walk under a ladder, or that black cats are omens of bad luck, or that the number 13 is a dangerous number. And I had to laugh because Orion suggested that people change their seats. But what if somebody had sat in a seat, I don't know if they're numbered here, I guess they are, but what if they had sat in a seat that was definitely not 13, and they were forced by other people to sit in the number 13 chair and they didn't want to do so? That would seem like, to me, a very strange thing, to think that the number of a seat could have any impact whatsoever on the way that the universe evolves. There are all sorts of things like this that exist in belief systems of one religion or another, or pseudo-religion. There are things that are kind of like religions. There are belief systems like people who believe in pyramid power or who knows what, kind of pseudo-scientific beliefs or things like that. There are many kinds of beliefs that exist about causes existing on a level that has nothing to do with that of particles. And to my mind, there isn't room for these two different kinds of explanations. What we have learned over these hundreds of years is that what happens in the world on the macroscopic scale, even if we don't know quite why it happens, always happens because of microscopic things. Thus, I have a cold now. And I don't think that having a cold is the result of some kind of divine intervention or any other thing. I think it's because of microbes and so forth and so on. This is sort of a viewpoint that pervades my mentality, pervades my way of looking at the universe, and it doesn't allow me to imagine that there is anything else. And one last thing about where morals or morality comes from, like not wanting to kill babies or something like that. I'm a vegetarian. I am for moral reasons. It has nothing to do with God. It has to do with not wanting to kill. I don't want to kill anything, even little insects. It just repels me. And I suppose you could say the reason is simple. It comes from empathy. It's the golden rule. It's nothing more than that. The golden rule, or empathy, is an automatic alignment of myself with other creatures. I imagine myself in their shoes, so to speak, and I try to do what I think they would want me to do. And it's as simple as that. I don't need any fear of retribution in an afterlife. I don't need any set of morals that were given to me according to some book. I just obey the dictates of empathy. And that's pretty much what my morality comes from.
So Dave, you transitioned from believing in God to not believing in God.
Yes.
So can you tell us a bit about how you perceive like that shift in the source of morality for you?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I'm very comfortable. The short answer is that I'm very comfortable with a picture of morality that involves a level of evolutionary explanation, and including social evolution, and then a level of choice that's smaller, I think. It's not purely choice, it's a combination of those things. But I also, for me, the shift was very much away from the requirement in my mind that the morality that I have be objective in the sense that it's eternal and timeless and completely unconnected with any kind of a temporal perspective. And so the example I think maybe is a decent one is, but I don't have to be convinced. Let's take imagine a society where we have magical duplication machines where you could just instantaneously get any physical object. You just go, oh, I like that iPhone, and it's there, right? I don't have to be convinced that stealing in that possible world would be wrong for me to have a moralistic or a moral viewpoint on stealing in this world. And so the objectivity or the need for objectivity to me is just, it's not as important. I don't require that my moral sense be timeless, or that a billion years from now, when there's no planets Earth or and humans are long gone, that it'll still be true that you shouldn't do that no longer is important to me, and I'm okay with frameworks of morality that are local in that sense. But I have a quick comment, if you don't mind. I actually do want to throw in, if you don't mind, with the this idea of the compatibility, because I do think I think this was a point made by Steven Weinberg in 2006, and there was a symposium where they were kind of discussing these issues. And it seems to me like
science replaces explanations that were once sort of the purview of religion over time. And so there was a time where if someone had schizophrenia or some other neurological disorder or something, where they might, we might think, or religious might think that person was possessed. And now we don't think that. Science has replaced that explanation with one that's much deeper, at least in some cases, right? And so I think, someone like Collins, and I think obviously they're able to do great science to the degree that their philosophical commitments or their religious commitments don't expose them to maybe being wrong about something. So, for example, let's say pretend that science is able to show very, very clearly that we can explain everything about the human mind through study of the brain, study of neuroscience, things like that. If you have a really strong commitment to the reality of a soul and that kind of thing, are you going to be able to make progress in that kind of science? Are you going to be led to do that? Are you going to have an interest in doing that? It seems to me like there is a point of possible, it's not logical incompatibility, but it's conflict for sure.
And that leads me into a great question that we touched on when we were planning this, and that does science itself threaten belief in God? Because Doug talked a bit about the history. In Newton's day, there was much less known about science, about the natural world. But as we've progressed, we've accumulated a lot more understanding. So, John, would you say that there's still room for science to find out more that today we call the purview of God? Or?
Yeah, definitely. Let me first respond to something that Doug said. Let me be totally clear. I do not think that people, if someone is an atheist who doesn't believe in God, that they can't be moral. They can be more moral than me, which might not be hard to do. But I think that there are plenty of extremely upstanding people who don't believe in God, who live very righteous lives. And I don't, and you're an example, and you have obviously the commitment to not harming other animals. And I respect that. So I'm definitely not going around, I think, saying that if you don't believe in God, you can't possibly have morals of any sort. I think the only point that I would like to make about that, though, is that when you do assume morals, whether they're by enlightenment, ideals, or common sense, or empathy, or anything like that, what you're doing there is you're taking something that cannot be scientifically proven. Okay? You're making philosophical assumptions outside of the scientific method. And in that sense, you're making, to some extent, well, not even to some extent, you are making a commitment of faith. You're assuming certain principles that you cannot prove from a molecular basis. That's okay with me. That's fine, because I do that too, right? I believe that there's a God. Okay, but what I'm mainly trying to say is that we all do this. We all have two spheres of our lives in which we make certain assumptions that you cannot arrive at purely by rationality. Okay, so that's my parenthetical comment. So then what you were asking was, does science interfere with religion? Is that what your latest? I think it can in the following way. Let me go back to this is probably going to make the paper, the band-aiding with the baby, okay? Somebody will draw a little diagram and put my face next to it. Okay, so if you go back to that, I think evolution can, it's science. By the way, I subscribe to evolution, I'm fine, as does Francis Collins, and St. Augustine, church father, 300 AD, he did not think you had to take Genesis literally. This idea that you must take Genesis literally is actually a very relatively recent idea that came up within the past 100 years. Okay, so you don't have to do that. Many people in the Christian spectrum have different degrees of believing it, whether you have to take it exactly literally or whether it's figurative or so forth. We can talk about that. But the idea that evolution by itself can explain how we should behave, I think is pushing things too far. So E.O. Wilson, who wrote this book, Sociobiology, says that basically what we can do is get all our morals from evolution. So groups evolve so that they have good respect for each other, nobody abuses things, nobody cheats. And so if you have a group that abides by these rules, it will outcompete other groups. Okay, that's fine. But what evolution also says could happen is one group could come over and kill another group, and their genes would be gone, and that's a viable solution within evolution. Evolution says nothing is wrong about genocide any more than a leopard, killing a gazelle and eating its guts out. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just how it happens. Too bad your genes don't go on. So if there's one group of people that wipes out another group of people, and you're just taking evolution from science, it's going to say there's nothing wrong with that. Evolution can't say that there's anything wrong with any of that type of behavior. Okay, so you cannot get to emotional, well, I would say ethical considerations purely from science. So I'm fine with evolution, but when people start pushing it and saying this is how we know we ought to act, all we have to do is we need to just look at evolution. Or for neuroscience, what sometimes people do is they say, okay, we look at this part of the brain that's being activated, it's the prefrontal cortex. And that's more recent evolutionarily, and it tells you that you should act a certain way. We should listen to that because that's the most recent part of our brain. This leads to disastrous consequences. So science sometimes oversteps the bounds and starts to make ethical statements, both in evolution and in neuroscience. And there I think there is a conflict. It doesn't have to be, and I think that's why discussion is a good thing to have. We can say, hey, look, I think you've gone too far, and here's why. And you can tell me why you think I'm wrong. That's okay. So I do think that, yes, there are cases where people do that.
Anyone care to jump in?
I think I would say, I think I'm pretty much in agreement with what David had said previously, that in general, I see no reason why science should threaten belief in God. However, I do think that advances in science are going to, almost as a matter of definition, challenge fundamentalists. And I'm using the following, I think is a more or less standard definition of fundamentalism. First, believers should return to eternal and unchangeable rules laid down in the past. Secondly, that these rules allow only one interpretation and are binding for all believers. And third, that religious rules have priority over secular laws. And I think in this last case, that more or less guarantees that fundamentalists will see a conflict between precepts of their beliefs and advances in science, particularly when they challenge these eternal and unchangeable rules to which they subscribe. And so, for example, the fact that science tells us that the probability that the universe was created less than 7,000 years ago is vanishingly small, that the Earth is not the stationary center of the universe, and that there was never one pair of humans like such as Adam and Eve. The number of humans science can track down pretty decisively for us. And likewise, that the probability that there was a worldwide flood in the past 5,000 years is, again, vanishingly small. So I think, in that sense, as Weinberg had mentioned, advances in science, I think, will necessarily challenge the belief systems of fundamentalists.
Okay.
Well, I could say, I think the word God is so amorphous and so blurry that, of course, you can believe in God if it's sufficiently unconnected, if the God is sufficiently unconnected with what happens in the universe. That is, Einstein, several centuries after Newton, was not religious in any conventional fashion, but he still enjoyed talking about the old one, as he sometimes referred to a kind of a deity, a kind of an imaginary being who was responsible, you might say, for the laws of nature themselves. I mean, I don't think Einstein really believed that there was some human being who had created it, but it was a metaphor. It was a kind of a metaphorical way of talking about the mysterious thing that brought into being our universe with its laws. And, as myself, I think there are certain questions that are too big for us to answer, for us to, so to speak, wrap our heads around. I realize that today in cosmology, all sorts of people are talking about, even just in the last week or two, things that happened in the Big Bang to bring the universe into existence, new evidence for so-called inflation, and things that I'm really not very familiar with, but that I've heard about, that talk about the cosmos and perhaps the existence of not only our universe, but millions of other universes that are branching from each other ad infinitum. I mean, these kinds of things are so, to my mind, science fiction-y and weird that they make me uncomfortable. Maybe you might just say, well, okay, so you're not in physics. That's true. I got out of physics because I was so uncomfortable with the science fiction-y. I got my PhD in physics, but I got out. I escaped because too much of physics, especially things like cosmology, but even particle physics, was surrealistic and science fiction-y to me. And it troubled me enormously. And speaking of Steven Weinberg, I might just give you an example. He wrote some of the classic books on field theory. This field theory is an advanced part of particle physics. And the first two books, I don't remember what they were called, but I do remember that the third volume was about something called supersymmetry. Now, this volume, which was several hundred pages long, filled with mathematical results and theorems and proofs and blah, 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 all about things for which there is not a shred of evidence. Not a shred. And he knew that. He knew full well, but he was a believer that supersymmetric explanations, supersymmetry was the coming thing. And so he was willing to devote a large portion of his life to writing a book, a textbook, a highly technical mathematical textbook about something for which there was not a shred of evidence. This, to me, is a weird way of doing physics. I respect Steve Weinberg very greatly, but at the same time, I found that extremely weird. People are weird, after all. We all are weird. In any case, Einstein believed in a very amorphous God. God, it wasn't a God that you could pray to. It was not a God that you could ask for favors. It was not a God who would intervene in human affairs. It was not any kind of God like that. It was much more of a mystical belief that there is something unfathomable about the universe that we may never understand, and this is sort of worth a feeling of reverence. And I admire that. I mean, I feel the same way, but I don't extend that to any sense of a belief in a personal God. A personal God's something or someone, you might say, to whom one can pray. That was eliminated from my belief system roughly when I came across this book at about age 14 or 15.
Okay. So at this point, we'd like to open it up for audience questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand. I'll point to you. You can stand. We've got one ready right there. Just go ahead and stand up and project.
Yes, you're the guilty one. That's right. I believe in God.
You're confronted with scientific fact about the Big Bang and particle physics that point toward a non-religious scientific creation of the universe. How do you reconcile that with God?
Yeah, sure. Okay. No, excellent question. In fact, this kind of...
Can you repeat it just quickly?
Yeah, so how do I reconcile my belief in God with the science of the Big Bang and particle physics that point to no God, I guess, or to a materialistic explanation? Is that a fair phrasing of what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So are you saying God arranged those particles in a certain order to create the Big Bang?
Yeah, so, okay, great. So this gets a little bit back to what Dave was bringing up earlier and Doug just echoed, which is this idea that does science push out religion? And I would say here's a case where science actually leads to God, okay? And so here's what I would... Physicists have written papers, and what's that one that says the 17 constants and why they lead to life or something like this? So these are written by atheists. Why is the cosmological constant exactly at the right value it should be? There's about 17 constants. If they were tweaked by just a tiny amount, sometimes as small as 1 in the billionth part, bigger or smaller, you wouldn't have life. It's not that you wouldn't have, that Doug would have a green head and that I'd have a blue head. It's not that life would be different. You wouldn't have life at all because you wouldn't have star formation. All these constants have to be within a very, very narrow range. And if you're not in that narrow range, then you don't get anything. Okay, so that is something that was only recently found out. So I would say, if anything, the Big Bang and the fact that all these constants are bang on is, I didn't even mean to do that. Bang on. That, if anything, strongly suggests that something is cooking. Okay, so ordinarily in science, what you do is you say, okay, let's take these variables. Let's say the gravitational constant. Let's flip it. Let's spin it to some random value. Let's say the mass of the electron, mass to charge ratio. Let's spin that. Let's randomize all these values. Okay, and if you randomize them, you don't get life. Okay, so if you find that only under this very special condition you get life, and the probability of that is very, very low, then normally what you do is you conclude that you have a non-random agent that is leading to the current state of affairs. Okay, so we have a non-random agent. What are the properties of this non-random agent? This non-random agent had to be pretty powerful because whatever this non-random agent was, it launched the whole thing. So it's pretty powerful. This non-random agent is outside of space. Okay, so it's transcendent in that sense. It's outside of time, so it's eternal in that sense. And it's pro-life. So it's got these properties. It's not a leprechaun. It's something pretty impressive. Okay, and so those things actually point to, I would say, more than anything, and there's a huge literature on this right now, and it is controversial, and I'm sure you guys will fire back at me, but I would say that's one of the best arguments that has actually come out of recent science pointing toward God. So it's almost like I could have paid you to say that. I didn't, but I suspect you're actually on the other side, but that's okay with me. So yeah, how do you guys want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think I would respond to that by pointing out that that when you look at the world around you, I mean, this confirms your belief in God and you see harmony in this. On the other hand, when you go into your lab, you are going to obey the rules by which scientific inquiry is carried out. And in particular, you are not going to embed your science, put it inside a predetermined religious or political framework. And I would say that it's under those conditions when I think that science really suffers or dies. When you start with a religious or political framework. For political framework, I think an excellent example is the Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union, where they determined that if you like this Lamarckian picture of inherited characteristics, or acquired characteristics being inherited, fit with dialectical materialism, and therefore they pushed its. Yeah, it was a disaster. And I think you get similar disasters when you start with a religious framework and then try to embed science inside it. One example I would give is the answers in Genesis, where you start by assuming that the Bible is literally true, and then essentially try to reverse engineer a set of quasi-scientific principles that would lead you to those results. So I just want to be clear that you see no conflict between them, but as a scientist, you're going to play by the rules.
Yeah, I'm going to play by the rules, and I think those rules were created by God, right? I mean, I think that,
sure.
I'm happy to play by those rules. Yeah. So no, I agree with what you're saying, and I sympathize with that, and I don't subscribe to, let's say, everything that Ken Ham says. No, I don't. He's the guy who recently debated Bill Nye. I'm not that. I mean, I don't think that seeing Adam riding on the back of a Tyrannosaurus Rex is a picture that I would endorse. And I also wouldn't say that if you're a Christian, you don't have to believe it. Right? There's a wide spectrum of beliefs within Christianity, and I would agree that that's not good science. I don't think it is. So I'm with you on that.
Well, I have a question for you. Just since we're talking about Christianity, and I think you say you believe in Jesus Christ and such things. I'm just going to ask a naive question that comes to my mind, which is, was Mary, Jesus' mother, fertilized, if that's the right word, by God or by some non-human agent?
Well, if I believe he created the whole thing, that would be like a little parlor trick, right? If he had to fertilize Mary, I mean, that's not hard.
But
right?
that's what I'm saying.
Five inches in a row. Look, he can pull this stuff off. Okay, so I think a more fundamental question. You can always think of silly little questions that, or the things that might seem potentially embarrassing, like, well, did he really stop the sun, for a whole day when Joshua was fighting? Did he do this or this or this? But I think the bigger question that subsumes all of those questions is, was there a God that basically is responsible for the order that we find and even the existence of everything here? And I would say, let's answer that question first, and I'm a big affirmative on that, yes. Now, if he is an agent that's acting somewhat outside of your billiard table, he can come in with his billiard cue and hit a ball and cause it to do something that was different from what your calculations would have originally said. Okay, so the system isn't closed. So I don't throw the ideas of laws of physics out. I believe in physics. I believe in Maxwell's equations, I swear. But also, I'll do that. So yeah, I mean, as we were talking about earlier, I'm a dual citizen, right? I mean, I believe in God, but I also believe in physics. And maybe at some point there will be an incompatibility, but I'll deal with that when I come.
See, I'm more the person who would say, I don't know where the billiard table came from. I don't know where the laws came that defined how billiard balls crash off of each other. That part is mysterious to me. It may be an unfathomable mystery, but I say that maybe if God created the billiard table, that's fine. But a lot of people, I think, some people who are religious believe that God created the universe, but then does not intervene anymore. And doesn't come in, and doesn't come in with the cue and hit the ball anymore. And what you're saying is to come in and make Mary pregnant was coming in with a cue. And
I don't tell dirty jokes. I do.
so anyway, I think the point.
Turn the tape off. Turn the tape off.
I just wanted to raise this issue because I think it's a good example of where I could find what I think of as a real incompatibility between science and religion, and I just wanted to bring it up to make a very concrete example. Okay, using my billiard table analogy. And we bought into that, both of us.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, so I do believe in
Okay, great.
I think we should get some more questions.
Another question. You right over there.
Okay. Sorry, I apologize in advance because one, I don't have a very scientific background. Number two, I'm a bad public speaker. And number three, I have a bad short-term memory, so I don't remember your name on the end.
Doug.
Okay. Assuming like your theory is correct about, just everything being kind of a product of particles in motion just reacting to each other. If that's true, wouldn't that be like a great defense for any crime someone might be, accused of? And two, say the guy who walked into a movie theater and shot up a bunch of people during a Batman film screening, or even going as far as Hitler, trying to wipe out the Jews. Who are we to say that those people are wrong or Hitler's wrong if all they were is reacting to their particles of motion? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
So can you have morality in a deterministic universe?
Yeah. So it's not that you can have morality. I'm sorry. I can't believe you can't have morality. I mean, but where do morals come from in a sense? If we're all reacting or particles of motion.
Well, as as humans, we are unable to perceive the particles that we're made of, or that other people are made of, or the molecules in the air that are bashing each other around. As humans, we perceive large things. We perceive napkins, books, and so forth. We're made to perceive such things. We perceive other humans. And so we conceive of the world in a very different way from what is actually happening down there. I mean, inside this bottle, there are, I don't know how many, 10 to the 25th or some number of molecules bashing into each other all the time, trillions of times per second, and we can't see that. All we see is some water. We simplify it enormously. So when we come into existence, we always deal with the world on the level of macroscopic. We think of we conceive of the world in macroscopic terms. And some of those things that we, probably the most important things that we deal with at this macroscopic, not microscopic, but macroscopic level are other humans or other living beings. And we come to understand them not in terms of the particles that make them up, because we can't. Doesn't mean that they aren't there or are not, those things are not happening, but because the only way we can understand other people is in a very simplified way. We are not capable of peering down to the microscopic level, so we deal with it at the macroscopic level, and we talk about people not in terms of neural events happening in their brains, but in terms of desires and wants and wishes and hopes and interests and loves. It's not for nothing that people say love makes the world go round. It's a kind of a shorthand, very drastic shorthand for talking about processes that happen at a much more fundamental level, but which we are incapable of analyzing. And so morality comes from the fact that we exist at a macroscopic level, and we perceive things at a macroscopic level, and that's our only way of perceiving things. We have no choice, and so we frame all of what we think about other people in terms of those things that I said, that I mentioned. Desires, hopes, beliefs, fears, etc., going on and on forever, passions, and that's how we think of the other people. And when we think at that level, there's plenty of room for talking about responsibility and good and bad. There's no problem in talking about those things, as long as we remember that they're shorthands for things that are at a much more fundamental level, but that are invisible to us. That's all.
Another question. Let's see. You right there.
I think my question is is it David down here?
Yes.
Is it your opinion that religion and science compete for the same sort of real estate in a person's mind, and that a person might be left out in the cold if they had only one and not the other?
That's a good question. It's hard to try to answer that in any kind of a general way that goes beyond just my own experience. So I can just tell you what I feel like from my experience, and it seems like there's definitely a competition, or at least a sense where it's like I said at the beginning. There's a whole swath of ideas and concepts that are interesting to me now that would never have been interesting to me at all when I was a Christian, because I had answers for those things. And now that science that attempts to address things like where the self comes from, the physical nature of consciousness, things like that. So there's certainly in areas, it seems to me like there's it's a zero-sum game, one or the other. It's going to dominate, but probably not generally, right? I mean, I love my wife just the same as a Christian loves their wife, and in much the same way. So there's obviously lots and lots of area, sort of mental landscape or whatever, that there's no push and pull, I don't think.
Anyone else care to respond to that? Okay. Another question. Let's see. You right there.
I had a few points for John, and you can respond to whichever one you feel better. The first was regarding morality, and you were talking about you believe in some aspects of the Bible, and you talked about genocide as well. Multiple cases of genocide, slavery are mentioned in the Bible. So then is that a pick and choose, what you feel is okay? And also, like you mentioned, the different questions that you haven't been able to answer. Is that not a God of the gaps argument where you feel that, you don't have answers and therefore God is the answer to those arguments?
Okay.
And just with the genocide thing, I wanted to mention in terms of evolution of man, do you think that, early man had the same sort of principles in terms of genocide or, anything else that we haven't evolved in a sense, from early man to now in terms of our morality and what we need to be in terms of civilization?
Yeah. Okay. Let me see if I can repeat certain aspects of it to your satisfaction, and then I'll try to address them. So first thing I heard was the Bible mentions slavery and genocide. So am I someone who picks and chooses from the Bible and takes what I like and throws out what I don't like? So of course my answer to that is going to be no, I don't. But I have to explain why. So first of all, yes, there is slavery mentioned in the Bible. In fact, the Jews were enslaved in Egypt, and God tried to set them free. There's a letter Philemon that's written by Paul, and basically it is written to a runaway slave, and he's basically saying to the owner, or written to the owner of a runaway slave. He said, okay, he came to me and he's been working with me, but you really ought to set him free. Okay, so the Bible is not, I wouldn't say pro-slavery at all. I think what you have to do, this is a longer discussion, but what you have to do is say, let's take humankind from the very beginning. What was going on? Let's say there was no God at all, and you drop yourself down in Palestine thousands of years ago. What are the tribes doing? They're running around killing each other. They're running around trying to wipe each other out. They're making slaves, okay? You don't need religion to have this stuff happen, right? This stuff happens anyway, okay? So now if you're God, you come down and you go, how am I going to work with these people? Am I going to tell them it's all about the heart? Am I going to go, hey, look, you got to listen, and you got to, don't lust after a woman, don't do this. I mean, holy cow. He was just trying to get them to not kill each other, okay? So he had his plan, as I understand it, and of course you're welcome to disagree, was to pick one tribe and basically say, I'll give you victory. I don't like the stuff that you're doing, but I'll give you victory. I'll say go wipe out the Amalekites, kill them, but now I'm going to work with you. I'm going to try to teach you something, and there's a progression in the Bible if you look at this. And if you follow things through, there's the Old Testament law, and then there's Jesus. And when Jesus does the Sermon on the Mount, he is not merely recounting the law. He's saying, I'm here to fulfill it. But what I'm doing is I'm talking about the heart. You think adultery is bad? No, it's wrong to look at a woman lustfully. You shouldn't even do that. So it goes from a very crude, barbarian state where they're at to some basic laws of civilization all the way to the heart level. So I think you have to understand where the Bible's coming from. And if you think that just because the Bible mentions somebody doing something bad, it endorses it, well, that's clearly not the right way to read it. A lot of it is a history of humankind and what people were doing along the way. So I don't think that God would be pleased with genocide at all. Did he command people in 2 Samuel to commit genocide? Yes, he did. And that's probably one of the hardest verses to talk about. And what I would say is those tribes were doing that anyway. And what he did is he used the fact that they were doing that to try to teach them something that would eventually pay off at a heart level further down the road. That's how I read it. You're welcome to disagree. So that's point number one, right? You got to take up the rest of the time now. Okay. So the second one, really briefly, God of the gaps. If there's, do I, come upon a gap in science and say, oh, poof, that's where God must be? No, I think that's a horrible way to go about things. I don't believe in a God of the gaps. So the thing that I just mentioned, though, is where the scientific facts are pointing toward a very powerful agent that has these properties. That's not a God of the gaps. That's actually a convergence of scientific fact suggesting that there's a very powerful agent that led to the initiation of the Big Bang that then created amazing order. I don't consider that a God of the gaps. And I don't endorse God of the gaps arguments. And then I think the last thing you asked was, have we evolved morally? Yes, I think that we have largely, I wouldn't say evolved in the sense that our DNA is encoding morals. I would say culture definitely changes over time and we become more aware of morals. So yeah, I think the moral climate has drastically changed since the Roman Empire, for example. Yeah, I would agree. Anybody else want to comment?
Okay. Another question. We're over there. Let's see you.
My question is for David. You had mentioned before that you were fairly religious growing up, and then you moved away from that. Like, what proofs, what evidences were you looking for that would have, I guess, influenced you to stay with your faith?
Right, that's a really, really tough question. So there's a lot of very different views of faith, and a lot of times, pardon me, non-religious people sometimes sort of paint this picture of faith among believers as it's a caricature, as being like, oh, believing in things you know ain't true, or believing things with very little evidence or no evidence. And at least for me, in my experience, faith was it was closer to the definition, I guess, that maybe some people attribute to C.S. Lewis, which is the idea that you have a relationship, it's trust in a being with whom you have a relationship. And so as I was saying, there came a point where that wasn't enough for me, and where I felt like intellectually I have to be satisfied beyond trusting. Right, and so it's you take it with a really good friend or someone in normal life. Even if they're the closest person to you, there are going to be situations and things that are important enough where you want more than trust. You're going to want reasons, and you're going to want good reasons, not just offhand reasons. And so there are a bunch of the very, very typical problems. I'm sure I'm not unusual at all in the problem of evil and sort of the nature of God and God stands at the foundations of creation, about ready to push the button or whatever, knowing that almost all of his creations or humans that have been created are going to be eternally separated if you do that. And so my problems were basically I didn't get any good answers to those questions, and I realized I know there are lots and lots of very sophisticated arguments for how you can try to patch over those things. None of those were convincing for me.
Okay. Another question. Let's see. Right there.
John, earlier, you were